Hello and welcome to our wonderful alternate assessment protocols on science. So let's talk about science. I am Stephanie Kidd and Miss Brenda Combs worked with me on putting this together, and she's going to share out today too. We're going to start out by just looking at our academic standards, alternate and our regular Kentucky standards, because we know that our alternate standards are taken from our Kentucky standards. So if you don't know where to find your Kentucky standards, you can go to kystandards.org, go to Kentucky Academic Standards. The wonderful thing about this is you're going to look right down through here and you're going to find science. It's got this wonderful emblem here. Click on it. When you go to the Kentucky Academic Standards, you're going to find that there is a version that is an accessible version, but you'll want to click on this one for right now. And as you go through, you will see that it talks about your educational goals, what your school is going to be doing, the legal basis of everything. And then it talks about primary, goes into middle school, and then, of course, and then into high school. And so when you're looking at your standards, you'll see that here's your standard. Here's the practices that we're going to be including, the disciplinary core and the cross cutting, which means what is it related to in science, and in math, what's it related to in reading, those kind of things. So you're going to have all of that discussed in your standards, and I'm going to go back real quick. But also, we're going to have your alternate. Now, where can you find these? Again, at educationkentucky.gov. We'll go here. You'll see how they have all the standards listed down here for your targets. Go down to the bottom because it's 4th grade, 7th grade, and 11th grade is what we're going to be looking at. Pull up your 4th grade. I'm going to just go into it. You'll see how it's done by the testing window. You'll also notice that it has like the earth science progression over here. So you can look at that progression. I love this progression part of it because it says, where are you going to find it in 4th grade? Where are you going to find it in 7th grade? And where are you going to find this in 11th grade? And so you're going to kind of know what you need to be doing in each part of this progression. So at elementary school, when we're talking about weathering, we're going to be looking at just making observations. We're going to be taking some measurements about the rainfall, those kind of things, the shapes of the land, how much is eroded. And then by middle school, we're going to be investigating that water cycle through the use of the concepts of a physical model. So we're going to change a little bit from that we're just investigating or just looking, and we're doing some observations. If we think about that, we're looking at it as, okay, what's right there in the real world for my kids to see? One of the big things that we can talk about with the weathering is flooding this year. We've all experienced it. We know what it's done to our landscape around us. And so that's a good place to start. But now in middle school, we start talking about that water cycle, and we start talking about the use of it, the physical models of it. And this one's real easy that we can do. Brenda and I had talked about it earlier, and I said, you know, if I was doing this, I'd bring in some dirt and I'd put it in a big tray and I'd let some water run through it, giving them the opportunity to talk about what's happening as the water runs through it, what happens when a lot of water runs through it. So if it's just a little trickle of rain, what does that look like? What does it look like when more water starts falling in? And then you can have like a big gush of water, and what happens when the big gush of water runs through. And so kids can have that conversation. And if we're letting them do that, then they really get into it. And we'll talk about how that changes, but we're also going to talk about the role in this part of solar energy, water, what's happening to the water, not just here in our area, but out west, what's happening to the water there, and letting them watch some videos and understand that. And then talk about gravity and how that changes as we go through. And then, of course, in high school, we're going to start talking about that rock cycle. We're going to be pulling that in. They're going to be doing some things. What happens when things freeze? What happens when things are thawing out? We're going to have conversations all the way around about what happens with water in different areas. So that's just some of the things that this gives you that opportunity to see. And like I said, I love our alternates because of the fact that it gives you your testing windows too. And I know it's hard when we're looking at all of our testing windows and what we're doing. So our next one we get back to that. So I have linked in here. You guys will get copies of this so that you can look at it. And this is just a small one. So that was the fourth grade progression that we were talking about. Also in fourth grade, this is the next part of it. And these were just revised in January of 2023. Now, also in our fourth grade for this, we looked at that performance level. And what's that descriptor of our performance levels? We want to make sure that when we're talking about this descriptor of our performance levels, that we are looking at the purpose and the practices outlined in our standards. That's going to be the big thing. And then really looking at that target, the targets that we want to do by content area. But the big thing that we talked about is many of these is it's still on grade level. It's still based on their grade level content area. So grade and age appropriate reference tools. They're going to be using those. So when I went through here and I was looking, I said, okay, what would I want as a teacher? Well, I would want to know what they need to be proficient, and I'd want to know what they need to be distinguished, right? So those are the things that I want to make sure that they know. And so when I'm doing this, I'm going to be looking at these. Look at these verbs right now and tell me what you know about these type of words. I want to be using authentic science materials. Again, this has to be grade level, age appropriate text. Has to be reference materials that are on grade level. It needs to be tools and materials that they're going to use. They're going to be making predictions. They're going to be using details. They're going to be interpreting and analyzing information, charts, data, any type of things like that. And they're also going to be identifying simply designed problems. So, and they're also going to be applying, right? Real world. This needs to be real world every day for that. I also look at what does it look like in a distinguished category. So I want my kids to be distinguished. I want them to be proficient. So what do I need to do and make sure that they're doing this? Using and developing a model, using, again, authentic science materials that are grade and age level appropriate. So these are very similar in what they're doing. The only thing that changed between these is this applying science skills and concepts to real worlds in a variety of contexts and environments, not just our environment right here in Eastern Kentucky, but we need to look at all environments and then to be able to answer questions and local information. So 7th grade, we go and look at the 7th grade standards, very similar. So we're going to go back through. Again, you can find the progressions here. I'm not going to waste a lot of time talking about this because we got some other good things to get into. But you'll see that, again, it's just building onto what most of the stuff we did in 4th grade. So when we get to the 7th grade, look at how this changes. Does anybody want to say how this is changing?
Well, if you're looking at the Bloom's taxonomy, you're going from applying skills till all the way up to using authentic science materials. So, you know, they're evaluating, they're hypothesizing, they're doing all these things as they go up the ladder there.
Exactly. And so in 7th grade, one of the things that I notice about this is we're really pushing that analyzing, right? We're describing, we're identifying, we're evaluating, we're explaining. Those are all words that really get us into that analyzing and application part, right? Before we were kind of in knowledge and comprehension and we were just describing it. But now we're there. Good catch, Brenda. And so for distinguish, if we look at that one, again, very similar and not much has changed, but one thing did change. It says using and developing detailed models. So not only is the student at this point using a model, but they're developing their own models. And that can be a little questionable for some of our kids. Also constructing and explaining the outcomes of simple chemical reactions that are happening. And again, it says simple chemical reactions. So just taking a minute to look at that. Now we're going to see how this changes to 11th grade. Looking at all those verbs there, especially.
It was mentioned in the chat that the higher order thinking skills are critical in 7th grade for application of science content.
Absolutely. That's a big one. Now let's look at 11th grade. What are you noticing here?
It looks like now they're looking at claims. So they have to have the evidence of that because they're analyzing, they're using all the data. So they're actually going through those pieces.
And before we said that they were just working with models, they may build them, but this one says that they're going to complete models to represent a
Yes.
relationship. So that's harder. What else?
I think as well, you know, with 4th grade, you were just kind of, our students were being observant or were seeing and not really interacting with materials or science equipment as much as the upper grades are. I think in the 7th grade, it was a little bit more hands-on, more concrete stuff that they could see and they could touch and they could do some experiments. But I think if the 11th grade, you're looking at, like you said, developing their own models and their own representations, and then identifying and analyzing data that they've collected and evaluating that data, and just the progression from I'm watching it, I got my hands on it, now I'm thinking about it more and having to show how my thinking has evolved throughout the course of my science classes.
Yes, and one of the things that I noticed about as we changed, as we went from the environment in which they are in to environments which are outside, and then with 11th grade, we've got just all environments, right? And the ecosystems that happen around them. So, and we are constantly talking about the relationships between things. So it's the relationship between structure and function. It's the relationship that we see in the environments that they're working with, or the models that they're working with. And so they have to describe changes all the time throughout that. So that's another big thing, is we're starting to do a lot of comparison. And so that's the same thing with this, with to get it distinguished, we're adding some to it. Again, they're using and developing detailed models. We're going to be constructing and explaining the outcomes of a simple chemical reaction. They're going to be identifying and analyzing patterns to make predictions. That is huge. And we talk about patterns not only in science, but mathematics is full of patterns, and we're constantly talking about the patterns in mathematics and what does that need to look like. So in science and math, many things can go hand in hand as we're working with these, especially with like functions and graphs and those kind of things. You're looking for the math inside of that. So good example. So one of the things we went through those, and like I said, those are things that you can find pretty easily. But let's talk about the fact that science is explorable. What does that mean for science to be explorable? When you think about science, what is your thoughts on science in general, science class? What should it look like?
I'm thinking more manipulatives, especially when we start out in the 4th grade, and of course, as we advance, it gets a little bit more technical. But you know, simple stuff in the 4th grade, doing the things that are around maybe in your area, those types of things, instead of as you get older, you're going to go outside the box and go to real world stuff. So I think that's one thing that we look at. And the one thing I really like at the bottom of this is this do multisensory. Those are things that we really need to address and try to use, because we need as much as we can with these types of students.
So when I'm thinking about science, I said hands-on activities that stimulate the senses. That leads right back into the do multisensory, right? It aids to stimulate our senses. They need to take a science walk. They need to be able to breathe in, and if they're outside, and what does it smell like? What does it look like? Don't say what does it taste like, because that can get bad. But you know, what does it look like around you? What's the colors that you're going to see if we're comparing fall, if we're comparing spring? What's that? What does it look like after we've had the flooding? What colors did you see? What was something you noticed that changed? Those kind of things that happen. We've got, everybody's got pictures of like what happens with the flooding and those kind of things. So if we're doing something on this science with the water cycle and erosion and those kind of things, we can use some of that. But also announce the work that you're going to be doing in advance. Allow them to mentally prepare for it, sensory wise, and only get out materials that are needed, right, when they're working with science. This is some of those things that we want to keep in mind, that we don't want to overstimulate them. So maybe only have the materials out that they need and color code things when needed. We want them to have realistic time accomplishments on projects. So we want them to be able, we may have to chunk the projects down to where today we're only doing small bits of it, and tomorrow maybe we're graphing it, and then the next day we're talking about and analyzing the graphs and compared to the models that we've done. So those are some things that we can think about, but always tie it to the real world. Science is real world all the time. Kind of like math. Math is a lot of real world too. We can always tie our math into something in the world. So making sure that we do that for our kids. And flexibility is choosing activities and materials that, again, are related to our kids in a way that they can engage in the science. So being willing to take it back a little bit, only do small chunks, but be able to take maybe the materials and changing the Lexile level on it. You can put the passage in and it'll change it to where it's easier for the students to read. But if they're having trouble reading, back it up with pictures. That's always an option for us. And many times we can just put it in Google and it'll give us images. So having that opportunity for them to be able to do that. Identifying and analyzing patterns to make predictions is all the way through science. We know that patterns there, it gives us an order. We start to see patterns in behavior. We see patterns in situations and how to resolve problems. But some of the ways that we can look at patterns every day is to making sure that we have a pattern of the day in our calendar time. That can change every day, the type of pattern that we're giving our students, or maybe we need to practice a certain pattern for a while. So we put a pattern in there. Do a pattern walk and look for patterns that happen all around you. Sometimes we can go by a building and you'll look and the windows are set up in patterns. Have those conversations about where do you see those patterns at. Create patterns through stopping, clapping, music. Music has patterns throughout. And so let the kids have time to hear those patterns. Let them clap to the patterns. Our kids typically will find in music the best things for them, because they understand, for some odd reason, music talks to everybody, right? It's the place where we all come together, is music. So giving them the opportunity to find patterns in music is a great way for our students to start understanding patterns. And you can even show them notes, like in how the notes form on the staff. And then when they see that those notes form on that staff, what's the pattern that they're going to start seeing with it? Also missing elements and patterns. So one of the things you can do is have patterns, have a missing spot, have them to tell you what's going to be in that spot. So maybe we got a pattern that's going on 2 or 3 times, and then say, okay, what's missing? And so that they have to pick up the missing pattern. This is the feedback cycle. Now, many of you guys may not know what the feedback cycle is, but it's basically a graphic organizer to help our students. And the feedback cycle can be used with just about anything that we do in science. So a good example is we start with something, this happens. So this will happen because this is happening, then this is what we're going to be looking at. And then how do we change it to where it's happening again? So if I'm sweating and I want to reduce it, and if I reduce it, my body temperature changes. If my body temperature goes up, again, how do I get rid of my body temperature going up? I start to sweat, right? So this is just one. So here in this link, you will see, I'm gonna get rid of a couple of these things at the top. You will see that it has patterns in science, and it uses the feedback loop for many of these. So this is the one about cooling. There's one about water flowing downhill. There's one about discharge, identifying capacitor discharge. But there's different ones as you go down through here with the feedback. Here's the feedback loop. Of course, you've got the howling amps here. We've got positive feedback, negative feedback. We don't want our kids always to have. We have cooling clouds. What does that look like? And of course, the feedback, as more things happen, you can put more images in. This is one of those graphic organizers that you could set up with your kids to where you could do this with Post-it notes. So you could have the kid put this in. If it's a plus, it's going here. If it's plus, it's going here. And then if it's a negative, you would put the negatives in there. So you just have positives and negatives all throughout it. And you could have that feedback cycle happening for each one of those. Here's one. Understanding of science. Radioactive decay. And then again, here's just an example, and I've just pulled these from the site. So, like I said, these are wonderful ways. And they've got multiple things over here that you can use for science. And I'm sorry, I'm scrolling, probably making everybody dizzy. But it's a great way for our students to understand what's happening in the science, just using positive and negatives. So one way, it's a good graphic organizer, and it gives our kids this chance to verbalize it. Like I said, you could have just some positive and negative Post-it notes are in one color. You could have Post-it notes in another color, and they could quickly do a feedback cycle. Modeling with science, we have types of models that we will see in science. And these are the types of models that we're going to see. Now, I'm a math person, so mine's always mathematical models I love. But of course, there's historic. There's also scale models that we're going to see. And scale models is also part of mathematics. So, and then of course, you have your theoretical ones. So using models effectively in science is the way that the kids describe the model in their own words. Again, if your kid can't verbalize, one of the things I will say is a PEX board is wonderful. Teach them those words. And I would have a PEX board that was just created for science. And you can find different PEX boards out there. You can find different images that you need out there for PEX boards. So don't be afraid for your students to be able to get that PEX board out and to be able to use it. And sometimes they can even have it hanging on the wall to where they can go point. However you may need for your students, but having a PEX board available to them is wonderful. For students who have trouble with that communication, that's definitely one of the things I would do. So this is where I looked at from models and education and why we use modeling. Of course, like I said, models is part of our science process. When we should use a model, of course, we look at that understanding that students have in resolving thinking, and so that they can start to see process. We want them to be able to do that. So finding a way for them to model it at all points. I'll put this one in there so that you have ability to go back and look at some of the different ways that we use models. All right, so next one. As a teacher, what are you going to do? You're going to plan for sense-making opportunities throughout your lesson, right? You're going to give the chance for our kids to put their hands on the science as often as possible and to be able to manipulate through the science. We're going to facilitate our students being able to talk and even argue to understand the activities and the topics that they're going to do. You know, we talk about math talks all the time. Science talks are a thing too. So we want to make sure that this is a good opportunity, like I said, for you to get your kids really hands-on. Encourage your students to explain their observations. Again, like I said, if you don't have that opportunity, give them options of pictures so that they can put it in order to explain it. That's another way. So if I was working on an experiment, I would probably take some pictures while they were doing it, and then I could throw those up on a PowerPoint, and I could say, okay, or even on a Jamboard, and I can say, now order it in the process in which it went. So, and then they can take them and they can move them around, and they can say, this is the process that it, in no place that I have to give them the opportunity to actually talk. In that part, they can just move them in This is the first thing that happened. This is the second thing that happened, the third thing that happened, fourth thing that happened. So giving them those opportunities. Scaffold it. Like I said, that's a big thing for our kids. We have to chunk the materials down to where they can handle it. I had a student who could only handle about 10 minutes of work. So whatever we did in 10 minutes. I had a student who, if I got 3 minutes out of him, I was happy. So we would do 3-minute things. I give him a break, 3-minute things, give him a break, 3-minute things, then give him a break. So we need to know how to chunk our lessons to where they're getting the most they can out of it. Coordinate opportunities for our students to make connections about things that are there in real world. So making sure that they have that. And then of course, providing time for them. Many times for my kids, if it was something that was hands-on, they were so willing to sit there and do it. And they were so willing to get engaged in it. So I tried to make as many things as I could for them hands-on. Students are going to, again, we're going to say they're going to talk. They may have to pick pictures, right? They're going to pick pictures that go with the concept you're talking about. Engage in the discourse and discipline, choosing that model, giving them a chance to talk about the steps, making claims, what's going to happen next, kind of like just a little prediction thing. Understanding the concepts and investigating, letting students to create their own models. Like I said, if I was doing the water cycle, like bring in some dirt, we would have a conversation about what happens at the different levels of when I'm pouring to the dirt. We'd do some measurements while we were doing it. We would see what was happening. I take pictures. So that's there. That's the good thing now about cell phones and how quickly we can upload things. I love it when we can take pictures and put them out there for our kids. And then always tie them to something that you know, they already know, like concepts that's happened right around them. And then of course, hand gestures just for yes and no for reflections. So teach them a little bit of sign language with yes and with no. And so they can have those conversations too. And of course, we're going to continuously review and revise. This is a 5E lesson. Now, I just recently learned about these 5E lessons. Brenda was with me. Brenda, what was your concept of the 5E lesson?
Listen, I loved it. I liked how the plans were laid out and how it was accessible to the students at various ages or grade bands or whatever you want to call them. But I got excited in this. I mean, it was one of the better sessions that I attended in the National CEC.
Yeah, so we were at National CEC and they came in with these 5E lessons and we were looking at them when they were talking about how they did these. They had a video of a teacher who was using that, the 5E lessons and how she was using a PEX board in her classroom. And it was wonderful to see the engagement that was going on. And the kids, of course, was using their PEX board to talk as she was going through things. Of course, they watched a little video at the very beginning because that's that engagement part, right? We want kids thinking, we want to connect it to their prior knowledge. We want them to have a chance to hear the language. So the video was perfect for them hearing some of the language that was going on so that they could reincorporate it. And just then, and to have maybe a little experiment for them to do. And she did that in this lesson. So the kids were really engaged in the very first part of it. But in this, of course, you know, we talked about earlier the science and engineering practices. What's that going to look like? So up here in your lesson, you would have, of course, your standard. And then we would talk about what's those science and engineering practices I'm going to be looking at, those disciplinary core ideals. They're going to be there. And then, of course, how are we tying it back to reading and writing? How are we tying it back to mathematics? What's going to be there for that? So those cross-cutting concepts that we're going to have. And then, of course, linking it to level descriptors. At some point in this, it gets into talking about those kind of things, but I think I would want to put somewhere in here, and after I thought about this for a bit, was really push that vocabulary. I'd want to place somewhere over here where I could write my vocabulary words. So in this, phenomenals to explore. So what are they going to be exploring? How are they going to be exploring this? We want those. Of course, you know, we talked about prior knowledge and UDL in this case, for some of those kids, it was just basically they had trouble communicating, so they had a PEX board. In this one, it talks about using a head switch for the student. And then of course, phenomenals to explore. That's where I was going to. what happens, having those questions. This is the place where you get into designing your questions, and questions get your kids thinking. And so how can I sometimes scaffold my questions so that I can make my kids really get into that thinking? And then I want to think about possible alternative concepts that may connect to it. So sometimes we don't always think outside the box, but what are some things, other ways that we can get our kids connecting to that one concept that's happening? And then, of course, barriers that you're going to face. We all know one is going to be time, and two is getting students to really understand and think through it. And then how am I going to get that information back from my students? So in this, I love the fact that there is a part where the teacher's going to do and the student's going to do. So does somebody want to make a comment?
Well, I was thinking about, I didn't know if they understood what those 5 lessons were, but it's actually the 5, and the words are like engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. That's what 5 E's mean, if you didn't get, but it's incorporated in this lesson right here. You just have to pick them out.
Well, we're getting ready to get to those, Brenda, and I'm glad you brought that up because you're a perfect introduction to these. So, well, these are all the preliminary things that we need for this 5E lesson, right? These are all the things, those 10 things are usually what's back in our standards that we're pulling from and thinking about our prior experience and those kind of things. But now here's where the lesson actually get started. So how am I going to engage my kids, right? That's the first E. And so we look at, this is the thinking part. This gets my students thinking, it gets them started, right? And then this is what me as a teacher will do. Then if I look at my second part of it, this is what the student's going to do. So in this one, they're going to talk about the story and share experiences about drinking lemonade. And then they're going to share ideas about what they think will happen to the sugar in the water. So most of our kids love lemonade or something to drink that probably includes some sugar. And so we could create these tasks for them to do. And so we're having them just to maybe watch us create the lemonade, or maybe they're creating the lemonade themselves and they're having to look at it. And then the explore part here gets them started with that they're collecting data on what they see about patterns in it. And so what's visible there, what's not visible, what happens to it. And so we have to pull those questions in, and this is what the teacher is going to be doing, and this is what the student will be doing. And then, of course, comes the explain part. So we've had 2 of our E's, right? We're going to engage them. We're going to explore, but now they have to explain. So in explaining, what they're going to do is they're going to make a connection with the science topic, and they're going to connect it with everyday language and with the science language. And this is where I said I would like to have a place over there where I could put my vocabulary, because I think that would be a good place. Or maybe right here in explain, just make a place for vocabulary for myself. And this is what we're going to have them to do. And this is a good place in that explaining that you might want to scaffold your questions for too, so that you can get your kids really thinking, because it's more about you getting your kids to think in science than it is really about what all we explain when we're doing one of these 5 E lessons. And then, of course, it's what the students will do. And then I love this, that they did this framework around claim, evidence, and reasoning, because we've got one of these things that we're going to do with claim and reasoning in just a little bit. But they did that framework because I think this, because they have to give an evidence, and then they have to reason. The science finding that helps me explain this is, and so they have to go back and they have to be able to think through that. So if you want to do a framework like that, this claim, evidence, reasoning, this is a really good one. And you can give your kids sentence starters so that they can actually work through those. And I've seen this with math classes many times. They'll have sentence starters so that they can start telling about their math when they're doing just a math talk. So what's wrong with us having science starters up there? And it gives our kids that opportunity to start with that and then to elaborate on it. And so, and then the next one is elaborate. They have to elaborate. They have to take that and extend it, right? Extend their ideals, and they have to pull in the science and understand that. So as a teacher, we're going to monitor our students and allow them to have that opportunity. We're going to get them talking again and telling them about why some of the sugar may not disappear in this lemonade. And then what's the students going to be doing as they're doing it? They're going to be exploring and tasting and doing all those things that they need to do. And then they're going to have to give out their findings. So it's a little bit more of the exploring. And then last but not least, they're going to evaluate. And as a teacher, you're going to monitor, you're going to ask questions. You're going to listen to what your students are telling you and what you notice about them. And then the students are going to respond to either questions, or maybe they're just going to complete a project that they're going to do. So that's how we're going to do one of the 5E lessons. So places you can find more about 5E lessons, I've got linked right here. So these are the parts of a 5E lesson. And they've got some different ones down here that you can actually use and go through. It's a really great way to write a science lesson. And talk about getting all your parts involved. For Bloom's taxonomy, everything, it's right here. Okay. So how can I get my kids engaged? We're going to look at the first one. A video, maybe a game, maybe some kind of display of objects that they're going to look at. Models, short stories, a bell ringer, some do nails. So back in my day, I'm old, we called them bell ringers. Now they're starting to call some of them, these are your do nails, and it gets them started with an activity that they're going to work on. And it can also just be a question about a model they've got in front of them. Great ways to engage your kids. KWL chart. All right, getting our kids to explore. For getting my kids to explore, I want to think about variables, hypothesis. I'm going to form one of those. I may have them play a game. I may have them to work on a model. I may have them to look at some real world data. I may have them to watch a real world movie and then maybe reenact it. We may look at letting the students choose what's going to happen next. And then, of course, at all times, we're going to be applying it to real world. In the explaining, we're going to look at vocabulary. We're going to look at the concepts, either drawing or using PEX boards or using diagrams that they may have to put back together. We're going to always, in the explaining part, be correcting any misconceptions that are happening. We're going to also ask good questions. So we have to pull out and think about all the good questions that we're going to ask. We're going to build arguments, and we're going to use the claim evidence reasoning framework. This is a good one. And again, it ties right back into that 5E lesson. Provide students with language that they need, that vocabulary that they need. And then, of course, have students to create questions. So let's look at using this explaining and modeling content. Of course, we're going to introduce it. You go down. This is all about modeling and those kind of things and using rubrics. So you'll see when you get here what this is all for. I want to look for the claim one. Oh, this is part of it. You got to download this resource. So in this resource is where you'll find it. But in there, when you're looking, you will find ways to do the 5E, and it talks about the areas and examples of what they might involve and how the kids will need to get started on having those discussions. And so it's a really good way to do that. It also talks about the learning cycle that students have. And so why you would want to use the claim evidence reasoning activities, trying to think of all the things that it has in it. And since I can't bring it up, but anyway, there's also rubrics that's in there that you can use. But again, you'll have the opportunity to download this resource for that. There's I think there's an example on like decomposing that's in there that it talks through and how you could use the lesson for that. So I'm sorry, I'm not able to get that one to come up, but like I said, it's in that download that you'll find this claim evidence reasoning, which went back to, like I said, when we're looking right here, this is that claim evidence reasoning. And it's, I think this is one of the beginnings. I think this because, and then the science finding that helps, which is the reasoning. But like I said, it gives you a good one on decomposing in there. So that's one that you can do. So elaborate. For this one, we want them to make connections. We start seeing connections between maybe even different areas, but we start making connections about what's happening. And then we make generalizations and apply them to new situations. This could be a place where you create a craft that goes along with this. This could be a place where you extend your knowledge by watching a video or by playing a game or even conducting more onto the experiment. When the students say, well, what happens if we would add this much water instead of what we did? These are the kind of things that we could do to get our students, like I said, elaborating onto the situation. And last but not least is evaluation. So how can I get my kids how can I evaluate my kids? Well, they can write, they can draw, they can create sketch notes on a concept map. Just have a conversation with your kids. Have them to demonstrate something. Maybe it's you demonstrate this the water cycle by putting things back in their by putting graphics onto a poster. Having them to reflect on the project that you just did. Problem-based learning projects are a great way for us to have our kids to evaluate. Play the game of Kahoot if they're able to. Four corners where they answer various questions, and it can be a simple thing of you putting up some things in the corners and you have them to go stand in the corner in which answers the question. Red light, green light. That's a great game to play. You can look it up, but red light, green light says if this answer is basically, it would be like a true or false. And if it's true, then they can move. If it's false, then nope, you have to stay standing. Or just having them to have response cards that they can show to you. And then again, this is a 5E lesson. This is another good model for that 5E lesson. If I'm going to adapt a lesson for our students, especially my students, I think about how can I change the questions, right? How can I get them to think about the most important parts? And then I also want to think about quality over quantity. I want it to be, in many cases, I need to be short and simple, right? I need to get the most bang for my buck in 5 minutes at the most. So I need to think in burst. And so how do I chunk my material? Can I use drawings? Can I use illustrations? Can I use stories? Because my kids would listen to stories. Is there audio recordings for some of my students they can listen to? That would help them because some of my students really love to listen to audiobooks. So maybe I had an audio recording of the science. Sometimes if they've got a peer mentor, you can have them to read a section of the science book, and they're more apt to listen to the person, a peer, than they are to you. And so this is a good way to get them started. Providing examples. Not just examples in word form, but provide picture examples for our students so they get that connection. Do a fact sheet or a concept map that has like arrows pointing to the next steps. That's a great way to get our kids started, or have them to create a fact sheet where they go find some of the information. So maybe they have to go and they have to look for pictures, and you bring it back and then they will put it on there and help you to explain what's going on. But again, chunk your assignments, make them small, write them down so that our kids are not overcome with all the information that's coming into their head. Sometimes that can be frustrating for our students. Create a storyboard. That's another way that we can do. but also modify your stories to where it's on the level that they need it, but yet putting in the vocabulary when needed. And then, of course, we always want to, if our students need it, to use a PEX board. I can't stress that one enough, especially since they're pretty easy to make. This is the water cycle, and this was taken from the National Weather Service. And if you notice, one of the things about this is the great thing about our technology today is it's pretty easy to remove all the words or even the arrows if you wanted to. But this is the water cycle, and I took it, like I said, straight from their website. And all I did was remove the words. And so I went in and removed the words, and I just have the arrows. And so we could easily make this one of those things to where we got some Velcro dots on there. They replace the words, right? But even if they can't replace the words, what can we do? So think about another way that we could do this. We could totally change this out to where it could be, you choose one, right? And so these are just some pictures I pulled real quickly from the internet. And maybe we're going to talk about erosion. And which one of these pictures over here would show erosion, A or B? And so they could quickly choose the picture, right? Which one of these pictures would show precipitation? And so they could quickly choose B. Things like that can quickly be done and pulled together. This one is on the ecosystem. And this one here, I was thinking about how we could do this. Well, actually, we could take out most of the picture and just have the words there, and the student could put the picture pieces back. The fox, the squirrel, the tree itself. I don't know how we could demonstrate oxygen very easily because you can't very well see it, but there are some things that we could do with this picture for that. Resources I wanted you to think about. Of course, one of them is ReadWorks, because there's all kinds of great science material on ReadWorks. That's just got little articles that you can start with. Like I said, our kids really do love books, and they love to listen to stories. And so this could be one way to do it. If you've got a peer mentoring group at your school, you may want them to help you out and do some audio recordings for you. That would be a great way to build yourself a library for later. And then, of course, Khan Academy is another great resource that we have for our students. One more thing that we want to think about when we're doing these is, of course, is our Google site for alternate targets. Don't forget that you have this available to you. And here, down here, you have all kinds of different resources for science content in these areas. And so if you click on these, you can download and make copies of for your own science materials. And there are different ones by 4th grade, by 7th grade, and by 11th grade. So that's a great place to explore. The other thing that we have is the Autism Classroom. Has wonderful science materials where you can go and you can get and print and download. And these have a lot of good activities for you to do too. So don't forget about the Autism Center. Of course, Storm Speech Therapy. This is where you can get adaptive books, but again, you can get icons that you may need for your students. And so this is a wonderful place to be able to look for icons that you may need for your classroom. And then, of course, with adaptive books that have like the little cloud, that's a wonderful one for science. This right here for our kids, for a science lab book, this is a wonderful science lab book for our kids. And again, it's got the PEX board stuff through for it, and it gets into that, talk about it, ask an open-ended question. This is a wonderful place to go. Let it snow. So here's a lab that you can do for January with your kids, and it gives them the opportunity to be able to write in these spaces. Of course, if your kid can't write, again, if they can pick the words, then you go down here and maybe you write in for them or write in the words that they choose. So if you've got a PEX board, this is a wonderful one. They've got, like I said, there's the science lab one for January. They got February all the way through. So this is a great resource to have. This one right here is the chat corner. And so if you're looking for some resources, This one has videos that they can play, and again, has a January adventure pack that they can do. And so you're traveling to somewhere. And again, this has those wonderful visuals that they can do. Truthfully, those visuals would probably be good for me to remember, because I am a very, I want to see a visual that's going to be able to connect me to it. So this would be probably, I would use this for all my kids. It has a video that goes along with it. And so they're going to the space station in this one. So again, great resources for you to have. In this one, this is just an elementary one, and it's an academic science study lesson. And these are just little lessons that you can do with your kids. And I love the fact that it's got those questions that are connecting it to language. I just wanted you guys to have resources you can take back, you can start to use. This is one for middle school. So you have one for elementary and one for middle. If you want to contact Miss Brenda or I, you're more than welcome to. It's just our first names and last names. I'm going to go all the way back to the front and really confuse everybody. But let me go back to the front real quick. It's our first name dot last name @theholler.org.